Joining us for this webinar. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you're joining from. Please feel free to use the chat to introduce yourself and tell us where you are joining us from. My name is Najjuko Joanita, Joey, and I am a Pan-African feminist currently based in Kampala, Uganda, and I will be your host for today's session. So just forgive me in case of any internet challenges. And I work with a Pan-African feminist collective called the Nawi Collective. And our work at Nawi focuses on cultivating macroeconomic alternatives that are grounded in economic justice and the liberation of African women and all those oppressed by unjust systems of power. And at Nawi, I lead the work on digital economies and the future of work, and which brings us here today. And our work here invites us to ground the conversations on digitalization and labor in Pan-African feminist thought and practice. And so while this is a new area that we are exploring, we've been looking at the threats and the opportunities that digitalization presents for the African working woman and persons who are othered by inequalities. So welcome again, and thank you for joining. I'll give a brief around why we are having this conversation at this time, but maybe for housekeeping, we have French interpretation available. So if you are a French speaker, you can go to the icon that has interpretation. You'll see either English or French, and you can choose your preferred language. And you can choose your preferred language. We also request you to keep your mic muted to minimize on the disruptions. And please keep the conversations going in the chat. If you have any questions, if you have any thoughts, please keep the conversation going in the chat. So one of the why we are having this conversation today. This year, the International Labour Conference is going to discuss global standards to support decent work in the platform economy. And the conference this year comes at a time when we are seeing a disruptive reconfiguration of geopolitics, with the politics of digital technology taking center stage. And when it comes to workers' rights, we have seen that digital platforms have increasingly dictated the dynamics of labor across the world. And so with so much at stake, we believe that it's critical to elevate the voices and the perspectives of the majority world in this global discourse, particularly feminist voices and alternatives. And so with that background, now we came together with Femnet, with Siasa Place, Akina Mama wa Africa, and Action Aid to convene this webinar series to build solidarity with workers and articulate an African feminist vision on decent work in the platform economy. And through these conversations, we are going to develop an African feminist common position on decent work in the platform economy that we hope will shape conversations and discourse during the 113th session of the International Labour Conference. And with me today, I am joined with wonderful, brilliant feminists who I am lucky and privileged to call friends. With our grounding session will be led by Leah, Eryenyu, who will give an overview of what digitalization has meant for labor, and through her session, we'll make sense of this new world of work, what technology has meant for platform-based work, what it has meant for the labor market and what it means for the employment question. We'll reflect and explore how digitalization and platformization reflect, reproduce, and transform social orders, hierarchies, and inequalities that characterize our different locales, particularly our African context. After Leah's session, we'll have a plenary of about 10 minutes, and then we'll go into other presentations. The first will be by Masana Mulaudzi, who will be sharing with us on labor and artificial intelligence. We'll be exploring the impact of artificial intelligence on the political landscape of work, and what really AI has meant for labor justice. We'll also be hearing from Abigail Osiki on decent work in the platform economy, what the key considerations are for shaping an international labor rights agenda, particularly one that centers the needs of African women workers. And our last intervention will be by Sunshine Komsana, and this will be a meditation on African feminist praxis. And here we'll be reflecting on what feminism means at a personal, professional level, and what that means and what it means as a political project, and particularly how we translate these struggles and this theory into our everyday lives, because really we live this is our daily lives that we live through. So that's how our session will look like today. And without further ado, I will welcome Leah, our first speaker. A reminder to please keep muted. Morosi, could you please help to find who is unmuted? Yeah, let me mute them. Please keep your microphones muted to avoid disruptions. Thank you. Yeah, so I will hand over to Leah. Let me just pin you. All right. Over to you, Leah.
Yeah, Joey, thank you so much for this invitation, and thank you to the Nawi collective as a whole, who have been friends, but I think better described as co-conspirators, because we are constantly up to some good trouble, one of which is this webinar series. My name is Leah Eryenyu. I'm based here in Kampala, Uganda. I'm a feminist political economy analyst. My work really focuses on issues of labor and public finance. That's how where you can situate me. I'm going to do my presentation by having some personal reflections and also sharing some provocations, just to get us thinking about certain questions that might be important for this changing world of work. Fair warning, I'm quite an optimist, so I'm not delivering good news. But I start off with my own personal reflection, because the one thing about labor is that we are all workers. And I think it's very easy for us to kind of situate ourselves within struggles for labor rights and for equality within that field, because we are all workers. So when I was preparing myself for this conversation, I was trying to think about a really exciting piece of technology that I'd encountered more recently. And there are quite a number of them, but underlying all that excitement, there was a lot of darkness. I'll start with the one that I complain about the most, which is the platform that I'm using currently to speak to you, which is Zoom. So the upside is that we are able to organize and speak across borders and across time zones because of the innovation surrounding the platform that is Zoom. The downside to it is that, and I think a number of people on this call might agree, that while the amount of time that we might spend on a meeting has decreased significantly, in complement, we have not received an increase in leisure time, which is basically what should happen, right? You should have a machine or technology that is facilitating your work to free up your time to do other things. But that's not what has happened. All the time that has been freed up has now been filled up with more work. So we could say that we've become actually even more exploitable because we are even more accessible as a consequence of this technological innovation. And then the other thing I was thinking about, this was something that I experienced a couple of months ago when I was in London. And I mean, maybe some people might not be excited by this because they're better traveled. I mean, I come from Uganda. There are not very many exciting technological advancements. But anyway, I went into this shop and I wanted to try on some clothes, as one does when they go shopping. So I went into the fitting room. Okay. Anyway, so I went into the fitting room. I had a couple of outfits, went into the fitting room. And I got into this space and there was a screen and it could detect every item that I carried into the fitting room. And on the screen, it also said, oh, you know, there are all these sizes available in the store. And should you want to size up or size down, you know, it's available. And I thought that was such an exciting thing. I was just like, wow, these guys are really far ahead. They're far ahead of us. But then an unsettling thought immediately came in. And then I thought, you know, there used to be attendants at the fitting room, such that if you tried on something and it didn't fit, then you could crane your neck outside the door and say, hey, do you have this in another size? Or can you help me get this? And then there would be somebody to help you with that entire process. And suddenly that piece of work was no longer there, or the people were no longer available. So anyway, those were really just bits of personal reflections on technology. And then when I think about the platform economy itself, and we're thinking about digital platform economies, all of us on this call could also say that we have maybe in the last week or in the last 2 weeks have consumed some kind of product from digital platforms. Maybe we've ordered food, maybe we've taken an Uber. These are things that are a commonplace right now. And perhaps we are not thinking about the consequences of the entry of this kind of work, which seems to make our lives so easy, the services that are constantly on demand, and also not questioning why convenience is being commodified, or there's a premium that is being put on convenience or immediate availability of services. So I have a couple of provocations, very pessimistic ones, as I said earlier, that have emerged from just my work, engaging with labor rights, but also now thinking more critically about labor on digital platforms. I have a thesis, and this is not fully developed. These are just my observations as somebody that is in the movement, that there is a desire to create a world without workers. And this does not mean that the workers would not exist. It's just that they would not be recognized as workers. So from where I'm sitting, I see that there is a grand fiction being created of that worker-free world, a world without labor, a world without pesky workers demanding for their rights. And so that is why advancements in technology are received with so much excitement And the word that we hear over and over again is efficiency, because human beings are being replaced by machines, supposedly, because that can also be interrogated, that machines never rest. They can work 24/7. Actually, if you've read some of the articles that have analyzed who's going to come at the top in the tariff wars between China and America, a lot of people have their bets on China. And the bets on China is because China has a more automated industry. It's not relying on human beings that get tired, that have to be fed, that have to go on maternity leave, all those complex, yucky human being things that make it difficult for companies to turn a profit. So a perfect world that we're going towards is one that does not have that human complexity and is being replaced by machines. But in the meantime, there is a rush to reach that world, even if the technology has not necessarily been developed. So there is a fiction, something that has been created that basically invisibilizes the work that is currently being done and makes it look like you're interacting with machines, which is not the case. So I'm thinking about this on two levels. I'm thinking about this, the rendering of work as invisible by the mere fact of us having to interact, of our interactions being mediated through an app. You're not really going to be thinking about someone's humanity when you're just clicking and getting an on-demand service. And then I want to think about it also as through the recategorization of the status of workers. And I'm going to expound on these. So when we think about the invisibilization of workers, for me, that rendering of workers invisible is akin to dehumanization. And I've argued elsewhere that I see workers as being abstracted into computer code. They're just ones and zeros, they're binary code. They're these inanimate beings whose welfare we don't have to think about. So the more we interact with these digital platforms, the more we are duped into believing that there are no humans behind them. And therefore, the less we empathize with these workers and the less that we think about their rights. In complement, the platforms also mystify who their owners are. So it's very difficult for us to hold people accountable. So the platform owners are absolved of any kind of responsibility. But you see, arguments have been advanced that this is simply how capitalism works, because capitalism works to dehumanize, to instrumentalize, to turn people into objects of accumulation, of profit making. So Gagi Bhattacharya, who writes about racial capitalism, talks about a reconstitution of human life as a tool of accumulation. But my argument goes further, and I say that both workers who are working on digital platforms and the humans that are using them are actually both being dehumanized by having platforms as the medium through which we communicate. So I like using this concept that I borrow from Aimé Césaire, who's a Martinican philosopher, who talks about this concept of thingification. I know that everybody on this call is familiar with the concept of colonialism. So Aimé Césaire argues that in order for the colonial project to succeed, which required the worst kinds of abuse and dehumanization and the worst kind of brutality possible, which is how colonized people became dehumanized. It required the colonizer himself also became dehumanized. And the more they dehumanized the people that they were subordinating and the people that they were subjugating, the more dehumanized they too became. And I argue that the same argument can be advanced to digital platforms, that the less we think about the person on the other end, the less we too become human. And therefore, it's very easy for us to become co-opted in the abuse of labor rights of the people that are working on digital platforms. I'll provide an example. In South Africa, there is an app called Swift South, which is an app where you can get the services of a domestic worker on demand. And quite a number of those platforms now exist for you to be able to access a domestic worker. And the advantage that they usually propose is that, these are professional domestic workers, and so you should pay a premium. So you should pay a higher rate than the market rate for other domestic workers. But what ended up happening for some of the platforms, they were not getting any bookings because the clients felt that the price was too high. Which speaks to two things. Number one, the clients did not see that that domestic work should be valued at such a high rate, or maybe they were simply not seeing the workers. Those workers were completely invisible. So actually, the company had to lower the rate of the bookings, and then that's when they started seeing people seeking out the services of the domestic workers. So we can say that we can see the clients, or therefore us, the consumers of these products, as being complicit in the dehumanization of these platform workers. The other thing that I talked about to support my thesis around a future of work with no workers was just that idea of recategorization of the status of workers. So for people that are on the call that are familiar with this, are aware that workers on platforms are not considered employees, but they're considered independent contractors who do not merit the protections and entitlements that employees do. First of all, there is a suggestion that this work is not important, or that it is not as skilled and therefore it doesn't merit protection. And as illustrated by the example around domestic workers that I provided. But we also have to question the profile of the people doing the work in the platform economy, because that can give us an idea about why these labor practices are so terrible and why they go unchallenged. The people that are providing their labor on these platforms are already economically, socially, politically disenfranchised. These are poor men, these are women, these are migrants, who already occupy a very low rung in the hierarchy and are therefore marked as exploitable. So it is very easy to recategorize them as not employees, or even to go a step ahead and say that their work is not necessarily work because it is not necessarily skilled labor in the way that we think about skilled labor as going to school and getting all these qualifications and getting a university education. But we have to remember that this is not something new. And I'm going to explain to you how this is not something new. This was already done to women, and the work that is done primarily by women, which is reproductive work. This work has always been conceptualized as non-work. A number of feminists have unpacked this concept, one of them being Maria Mies, who did this a great unpacking of how women's work is considered, or reproductive work is considered an extension of women's biological function, and also as an extension of their role as housewives, such that all women then have a housewife identity. It does not matter whether you're married or not. Everybody views us as housewives, such that even when you go into the labor market, you're seen as playing a housewife role, and therefore your work does not merit the value that you're asking. And that this is non-work because you're simply performing the natural biological function of a mother or that of a woman. So there is that creation of a regime of truth which is what now platform economies are doing, recategorizing workers as not employees, therefore having no place of recourse because the platform owners are not their employers, and also the clients who are purchasing their services are also not their employers. So all these workers are caught in that human rights free zone because you're neither here nor there. So then we can ask ourselves, how are these digital platforms entrenching and reproducing inequalities? So the selling point or the value proposition is constantly the one about the freedom of choice and flexibility. So you make your own hours because you're your own boss. But the experiences of platform workers show us that this is not the truth, that you actually have to be on demand 24/7, just in case somebody needs your services at whatever time, even if it's inconvenient for you. We see situations where domestic workers, for example, will get a 7 a.m. booking. If you have a child, that is too early for the daycare to be open, so you're more likely to turn down that booking. The challenge is there's a penalty for every time you turn down a booking, because turning down a booking suggests that you do not want to work. And so then you are blacklisted. But there is something also around that I kind of touched on already about who is doing the work on these platforms. It is a certain class of people. It's an overrepresentation of a certain gender. It's an overrepresentation of marginalized groups, which basically means that it entrenches this working class identity and says that there are certain people that are suitable for this work that does not require labor protections. But beyond that, there is such a clear illustration of a gender division of labor or labor segregation. So when you're thinking about Uber, that's where the men are. And when you're thinking about the domestic worker apps, that is where the women are. So this idea of the platforms providing freedom and allowing all kinds of people to penetrate markets or jobs that they had no access to before is a complete fallacy, because women are still being ring-fenced to jobs that have been considered feminized and therefore for women, and men are still being ring-fenced into those roles. So basically all they do is further what is already existing on the ground. Yeah, so again, they're just aiding and reproducing this regime of truth as certain works being suitable for certain people. The other thing that they say that they'll do is that they're offering better alternatives to poor jobs or to unemployment. And the workers do admit that sometimes these platform jobs are a better alternative to what else they could be doing. However, the wages that they make are still very poor. Some of these are eroded by the cost that they put into the job, the airtime, the transport, and things like that. So basically, at the end of the day, there isn't much that they take home in order to have a livable wage, even in situations where, in the case of domestic workers, there's a premium that's being paid over and above the minimum wage. When you see the costs that actually go into a worker being able to render their services, airtime, transport, and their time, it actually ends up being lower than the minimum wage. So maybe I can end off by signing a warning. So I started off by saying that we're looking at a future of work with no workers. And in this way, I was mostly thinking about platform workers whose work is insecure, whose work is precarious. But I actually want to sound a warning knell and saying that this kind of work is coming for all of us. The security, the permanence of our contracts, all those are things that are no longer guaranteed because the world of work is changing. So I am arguing that we are facing a future of work with no rights for any of us, whether you're a platform worker or not, as the platform economy gains a foothold, its abusive labor practices will undermine the gains made in other sectors for all workers, because that is becoming the model that is admired by businesses because they have no obligations. If you think about the recategorization of workers, think about yourself currently and the kind of contract that you have. Are you a consultant? Are you working at a university with tenure? There is, it's in line with a neoliberal turn of casualization of work, when we're never sure about whether our contracts are going to be renewed, because we have 6 months contracts or 12 months contracts. There's never any permanence, right? So whether you're working in an NGO or in a university, it is coming for all of us, because that is what is being looked at as labor practice. So I think what I'm saying is that there is a universalization of poor labor standards that are going to undermine all the things that we've taken for granted, rights and things that were fought for by our forebears. Some of you may already be seeing this in your own places of work. Some of you may be seeing this in the case of South Africa. Again, when it comes to the domestic workers, South Africa has some of the strongest labor legislation and protections and regulations around domestic workers. However, because of on-demand domestic work, that is now becoming a threat to traditional domestic workers. And by traditional domestic workers, I'm talking about those who've been working full-time, a live-in, a part-time, who are registered to the Labor Department, and they have access to unemployment benefits, for example, that are supposed to be paid by a portion of their wages and also by their employers. But the platform economy model is becoming alluring, because then it means that the employer does not have to pay as much. And so then that is where we're all headed. And so I think I can end off by saying that all our fates are inextricably linked. We cannot sit back because at the moment you think that you might have a much better job. I think that the future is precarious for all of us, because I'll go back to the thing that I said at the beginning. People who are owners of capital, the ones who own the money, really just want to get rid of the complexity of human beings and their demands for human rights and their demands for maternity leave, and to replace all of us with a more perfect future that has machines or that has workers, but with depressed bargaining power, such that all of us become precarious workers. So the only thing that we have to do is to join our hands, of course, and fight for all our labor rights. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Leah, for that comprehensive view on digitalization and platformization and the platform model of work and how it's changing the world of work for all of us. I mean, I think this year, but also from the pandemic, a lot of us realized how precarious our work is. And so it's important for us to think about labor rights and labor protections across the spectrum, not just in the way that we've been thinking about it traditionally. So thank you, Leah. We will have a plenary session for those who have any questions, any comments that they would like to share at this point before we transition into the next session. If you would like to say something, please raise your hand using the icon under reactions that has raised hand. I'll be able to ask you to unmute, because I had to unmute everyone. I mean, I had to mute everyone. Yeah, so, okay. Ghislaine, you should be able to Ghislaine, over to you.
Okay, good morning. Appreciate the presentation, and then also I want to say congratulations to our presenter. I totally appreciate, and I'm Dr. Ghislaine from ITUC Africa. I'm in charge of social protection and equality program. Then I'm agreeing with the presentation of my sister. But what can we do now as activists at feminists at global level to change the way that this platform progress want to put us and undermine labor rights now? How are we going to struggle? How are we going to campaign? How are we going to advocacy to stop this capitalism issue who are now blocking human rights and also in particular women rights? So that is my question. I want to add also, please, can you check the interpretation in French? Is not, I don't know what happened, but the volume and the quality is really bad. Thank you.
Thank you, Ghislaine. The interpreters, Sam and Festus, could you please check on French interpretation?
Yes, I'm getting, but it's really bad. It is not, the quality of the sound is very, very bad. We couldn't understand anything. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Ghislaine, for that. I'll take all the questions and then Leah can speak to them at once. Pato, you can unmute.
Hi, everyone.
Hi.
So thank you so much for that. I think there's some connections around what you said that before I hadn't thought to make, and I found that very, very informative. But my question is around, we are also now becoming well, I'm now an employer within this space that is rather, like you said, very precarious. So even the contracts that we're able to extend to our team have some of those terrible things that you spoke of very little security. And because, again, where we get our work from has very little security, what would your advice be for some organizations in our position? I think this also speaks to quite a number of the organizations on the call. How would you advise that we do better considering the existing ecosystem and the restrictions that we inherit due to systematic issues and then have to pass down to? That's it for me. And thank you so much again for your presentation. Very insightful.
Thank you, Pato. Andy?
Hello, yes, I'm Andy. I'm based in Jakarta, Indonesia. This is a very insightful presentation. Thank you so much for sister. Yes, so I have two questions. The first one is I want to ask advice that what is our recommendation where our manual workers that already face the automated sector. So automation in the sector of a garment, constructive workers, shoe workers, they're already facing a really automated machinery, and then also technology advancement. So what is our recommendation? Because what I heard, one of recommendation coming from a socialist that maybe perhaps we the workers also can invest the technology, so the sharing will be equal for not only for employers but also for the workers. I'm talking about automation. And then the second one is The second one is related to gender-based violence, because I think our sisters are previously talking about gender segregation, but how about gender-based violence that experienced by our digital platform workers, who are riders, who are massage therapists, domestic workers, because based on our research, they really have challenge how to fight gender-based violence in the workplace. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy, for those reflections. Okay. Okay, you can unmute.
Joey, I think I can take some of those reflections. Okay. Look, I'm going to tease you a little bit and say that the questions are unfair. I'm not the Minister of Finance, but I'll try. Minister of Finance and the Economy. I think I'm just saying that some of the questions are so broad and require such a multi-pronged interdisciplinary approach that they can't be responded to in full on this call and just by myself. But also from what Joey shared, I think that is the objective of these conversations, so that we can all, not just the Minister of Finance, so that we sit collectively as feminists and start thinking about alternatives. So maybe one of the things that I can share that some people have been thinking about, not just thinking about, but are now proffering as a possible alternative, is platforms that are owned by both workers, the so-called independent contractors, and the platform owners. So there is a shared model. In other words, I'm talking about a cooperative model, which means that the workers also own the platform or the app, and then there is a sharing of profits and costs and things like that. Of course, it's a perfect Marxist vision, and maybe I don't know what what plans Joey has in terms of inviting people to the webinar series that will be coming in the future. But there is such a cooperative platform model in South Africa called We Care, but I've not investigated it enough. But I think I'm just saying that there are people that are thinking about and proffering alternatives that would work differently from what we have. And then the question about, and I thought that this was such a beautiful question, asking about, for me, it suggested that someone is saying, I don't want to be complicit, but I am also a victim of the global political economy and the consequences. So I have no choice but to offer my workers or people that I work with contracts that are not secure, or not give them or create a work environment that will make them precarious. And I think that is understandable. I think what we are arguing against is creating that as a standard. We all understand that that is how businesses operate. That's how things, you start off with a small budget and you're able to redistribute the resources according to the budget that you have. I think you've heard the saying, you cut your coat according to the cloth. If you have very little cloth, it means that you're going to have a very tiny coat that you have to wear. So if you have a small budget, I mean, there is really no way of working around it. It means that the wages might not be the best, but you have complete control over the other circumstances of the workplace in terms of safety and security, in terms of making sure that the workplace is welcoming and that well-being is centered, even if you may not have the wages just yet. I think the goal that you have is to be able to create enough revenue and then pay your workers well. The challenge what we are arguing against is the normalization of this insecure work as the standard and the proliferation of that standard, such that it is not just platform workers, but even university professors are considered precarious workers. Even when you have a PhD, you are not immune. So that is what we are trying to campaign against in terms of the. And then in terms of broader things that need to change, if we're thinking about building solidarity and demanding for protections or demanding for change, the truth of the matter is some of this technology advancements have arrived and they're going to continue changing and even get more advanced. What we need to think about is how to continue protecting workers' rights in spite of that advancement. And so that is why we need to have very robust and well-resourced social security and social protection systems. And there are countries all around the world that are experimenting or are already implementing. You might have heard about universal basic income, that somebody should receive an income from the government whether they have a job or not. And you have to understand that all these solutions are in context, right? I'm going to proffer them, maybe share them as things that we could think about. It does not mean that we have to think about them differently. I understand that in a country such as Belgium, there is actually a sharing agreement between the government and the people that employ domestic workers. So there is a tax write-off for people that are registered as domestic workers, and they get an additional payment from the government. So even if you are in a context where people are saying, I either cannot afford care work or I'm devaluing care work, the state is saying this work is so intrinsic and important to what then ends up happening in the labor market that we are going to top up. So there is that kind of relationship. And like I said, these are not things that I can, solutions that I can think about all on my own. We're sitting down and we're thinking about innovations. But at the end of the day, if I can zoom out further, we are, and back to the point I made about cutting your coat according to the cloth that has been given you, is that we are part of a larger global political economy. We're part of an ecosystem, such that even if our governments wanted to implement some of these things, they're not able to because they don't have the resources. However, we should not let them off the hook, because then that becomes the default position. Say, where is the money going to come from? But how come they have the money to give to the military and to arm the police to be able to clamp down on protests from labor unions, for example? So holding the government accountable in terms of that. And I think that there is a lot to learn from some of the protests that happened in Kenya, led by young people last year, challenging the finance bill and the burdensome and abusive tax practices that had been proposed. Yeah, so let's continue the conversation. I'm sure I have not answered all the questions satisfactorily, but maybe some of the other panelists can tackle them in their sessions as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Leah. And thank you so much for what you have shared. That will be a perfect segue into our next speaker, Masana, who will be exploring things around artificial intelligence and what that means for labor. We will have a session, a next session of 3 presenters, and then after we'll also have more space for more conversation. Thank you, Leah. Let me just in Masana. Masana.
Hi, Joey. Oh, are you pinging me? I'm here.
Over to you.
Thank you so much. And yeah, thank you for convening and co-hearing such an important topic. It's hard to not be dystopian about the moment we find ourselves in. And I remember actually Sunshine's words when we were at CSW that we've been in moments like this before. And as feminists, we've survived. And we will continue to survive, even in the face of unprecedented challenges. And I also want to really thank Leah for what was really an important and comprehensive grounding of this work. And I think some of the innovation and the ways in which you've expressed the bigger picture of how narratives and elite interests are coinciding to form a grand narrative, as well as some of the recommendations you've given. I've learned so much from you. Thank you. So my name is Masana Mlaudzi. I'm based in Johannesburg, South Africa. I am a feminist economist, and part of the work that I do is I work at the Wikimedia Foundation as the senior manager for campaigns organizing. I'm here in my personal capacity, and alongside some other folks like Leah and Crystal, I'm also an Atlantic Fellow for Social and Economic Equity, and that's the primary hat I'm wearing today. I think someone flagged this as really important in the comments, that there's a sense in which people are reading technological processes apolitical as part of this grand narrative that Leah was talking about, that technological advancements and progress are really existing in a vacuum where innovation is the only outcome of tech. And so there's been a push to embrace tech and technological advancements in its entirety. Oh, I can hear the...
Sorry, Masan. Interpretation. Sam or Festus. I think someone needs, either you or Sam, there's feedback from one of your ends. Okay, I think it's okay now.
Okay, thank you. And I think, so I was saying that people often read technological progress as occurring as apolitical and in a vacuum. And especially in the conversation on AI, what we see is there's almost a pushback for people who are reluctant or point out some of the challenges with AI as being anti-progress, anti the rise of Africa. Activists and feminists always meddling in advancements and pointing out some of the challenges rather than looking at the opportunities. And yet I also feel like in the conversations on AI, unlike with other technological advancements, people have already begun to identify some of the present risks and opportunities, particularly the risks, though, for platform workers. And having labor as a central part of the conversation on artificial intelligence has opened up a bigger conversation that has politicized technological advancements and has politicized innovation, where people, I feel like there's a growth in the conscientization of the impact of the mechanization of work, especially amongst the proletariat or the working class. And I'm going to say a little bit more about why there's an increase in consciousness about the risks of AI in a little bit. These direct impacts that we see, though, they all speak to the severe limitations of our current macroeconomic and political systems. We have such a limited scope in reasoning that is profiled in our macroeconomic policy, where our politicians continue to emphasize growth as the end goal and development as an end goal without critically engaging with what that means and for who. Part of the challenge, though, with the growth narrative and the force of artificial intelligence within our work and our systems is also that it begins to impact not only our ability to conceptualize innovation, dream, as Leah was pointing out, it externalizes some of the precarity that we know people face, particularly in the working class. And I think that the link between the challenges that AI brings to the world of work and the broader colonial history of extraction, of norm setting, of violations of human dignity are intimately linked with how AI software is built. So some folks might be aware, but for those who don't, artificial intelligence is built through teaching a machine how to speak the language of the internet, right? There's some ways in which you can do that. One of the ways we know AI has been built is scraping the data of all of the open pages on the internet. And I don't know if anyone thinks the internet is a wonderfully feminist place, but I think the overwhelming majority of us will agree that the internet is actually a harmful and violent place. Secondly, we have large language models where these machines learn about the world, like Wikipedia, where I work. And we know that Wikipedia itself, because of the epistemic inequalities and injustices that we see in the world, also is a large language model that is filled with biases and problematic assumptions about the world, similar to the internet more broadly. And then there's the more nefarious way in which artificial intelligence is built, which is that we become the product of artificial intelligence. When you're using Facebook, when you're using AI to write your emails, even though there is a privacy clause, I'm not saying that it's true or isn't. How certain are we that our information isn't being used to build a software to create these autonomous robotic beings, as Leah was insinuating, who can replace the inconvenience of the working class? And when we look at the impact on the workplace through artificial intelligence, what we see is that the low-hanging fruit have been well conversed. People know you can use AI to copy edit. I personally have asked AI to write some of my emails in the tone of an American white man. And it's been very successful in meeting the goals that are needed of the people who receive the emails. But here's why there's an increase in the conscientization of artificial intelligence and its risks, is because the unemployment that the working class are currently facing is soon coming for all of those middle-class professions that historically were deemed prestigious and out of reach. The legal profession is at risk. Accountants are at risk. Coders and software developers are at risk. All of these professions historically have been in the upper tiers of privilege within the middle class. And yet, with artificial intelligence learning about the law through the internet, we see that it is actually able to give good legal advice. But there is, of course, when you think about platform work, extended vulnerability and the externalization of violence, which is that not only is AI built on biased software, but it uses the labor and the suffering of predominantly people of color, predominantly African, predominantly women, to clean the biases off that software, to make that software more palatable to a libertarian audience that claims to be progressive. The other impact of AI on the workplace, which is one that I haven't seen as clearly articulated, but one that concerns me more deeply than some of these other more immediate impacts, is the longer term impact AI has through surveillance. So we know for a fact that there is a rollout of artificial intelligence that is trained on biased software, biased norms and behaviors that's being rolled out in the workplace to determine what efficiency is. Some research by Our Data Bodies, which is a wonderful collective of Black women across the world working on surveillance, they found that in the Amazon factories, there's a canon created by artificial intelligence that determines how long a worker should be working before a bathroom break. And anyone who steps outside of that is infringing on the canon that is determined by an artificial intelligence that is built on a biased system. We know that in our laws, this is codified as protected rights. However, when we then look at the externalization of vulnerability to the proletariat, we know that in the absence of a clear contract, in the absence of labor protections, or when you are deemed to be self-employed, these protections do not always meet up to what is taking place in the workplace. Something else that concerns me related to AI and surveillance is some of the ways in which AI will be used to surveil the collective action of unions, of activists, of civil society organizations, of people in the streets, and in ways that are really dystopian, used to, I think, I don't even know what I don't even know what the end goal is here. I will say honestly, as a human who is afraid, but don't quote me on this. You know, there's almost a sense in which the robots that Elon Musk has built that would be trained on artificial intelligence and all of the rich people going to space, you know, that they have like a more dystopian view of the world, and they're just, you know, baiting us until they roll out their plans. It feels unrealistic, but when you look at the case of South Africa and fiber cameras, for example, we see that there is a continued rollout of public surveillance in partnership with government and private security. And so a private security company owns the largest network of CCTV cameras in the country and sells these to people. Okay, sorry, I'll slow down. I'm trying to meet my 10 minutes, Joey. If I can have 2 more minutes and then I'll start to wrap up. Similarly, so in Kenya, Article 19 found that there's been a rapid growth in surveillance. And what are these people or these private companies surveilling? The organizing activities of unions and activists, and also people going about their day, doing their human life. When I think about what happens a few steps down the line, then I instinctively think back to the role of collective organizing in very basic freedoms. So we know for a fact that unions and collective organizing has been important for getting the 5-day work week or getting parental leave or healthcare benefits. But imagine the inability to organize as laborers under a system of mass surveillance where it's even in our pockets and in our homes. I worry often that within this grand narrative of artificial intelligence advancements, that people forget to look to China and what's taking place at the moment, where China has rolled out a surveillance system using AI that has 200 million cameras in partnership with private security that surveils Chinese people or people within China going about their lives. And when you align with the state through their social credit system and monitoring, you get given a merit. When you disalign or you move away from the state priorities, you get a demerit. And the more merits you have, you can imagine creates a system by which you then are able to access services, access faster banking privileges, loan approvals. And if you have enough demerits, you could lose your citizenship, you could also lose your passport. And there have been some cases of the social credit system being used to target networks of people around the person who's receiving a demerit. So a family member, a friend who's in association with you. And so the surveillance moves from being purely technological to being part of a narrative of compliance, part of a narrative to ensure that people act in the way that is aligned with private or elite interests, whether or not these are part of the 1% or political elites. I'm closing. So Achille Mbembe argues that this absolute capitalism, this is basically capitalism, it's not even like late stage or post, it's absolute. It has found itself into every system that we have, has created the background for a planetary social war by elites against the surplus, which is unfortunately us, the surplus world population. So where to from here in closing before Joey tells me to finish? And what does hope for the future require? I mean, I just want to underscore to folks that it is dystopian. I don't think we've ever faced this level of technological infringement. And I really think part of the work we need to do is to safeguard collective action, because we know that is the only route to build power that cannot necessarily be infringed upon by, technology. We also need to build pipelines for resilience. I asked someone a few days ago, thinking through a project that I'm working on related to this topic, how did people organize global protests 20 or 30 years ago? Unfortunately, this means we need to go back to print mail, we need to buy stamps, we need to get used to sending faxes if people remember what those are. I mean, yes, we could go about codifying rights and protections in a surveillance economy, but we need to recognize the limitations of regulatory frameworks in an oppressive system. So we can't trust the law to do the work for us. We also need to do better at our grand narratives, which is that the far right learned that Black Twitter was a thing and created their own, but better. And so I think as formalized, funded civil society, we are still playing catch up. You know, no one watches the videos that your NGO puts out, guys. I'm sorry, that's not narrative work. Do you know what I mean? And there's almost been a depersonalization of politics, of political work, because we are relying on, you know, our paid work. Sorry, people who work for NGOs, it's true. The revolution can't be funded. Unfortunately, we need to go back to more grassroots levels of organizing. And then finally, two more, sorry, Joey. We need to embody redistribution as a work of political care. So something I've started to do as a wage earner in the economy, and it's not perfect, but I've started to redistribute my income generously, grossly. In a sense, with the understanding that if we have 5 years left and there's no water, I can't look to an elitist government to do redistribution for my network. And this requires us taking a long, hard look at money, folks, and the ways in which money has capitalized our conscience. And what does it look like for us to build systems of resilience, to go, in some ways, it's not even going back, to build on the legacies of feminists of the past, to bring our organizing local while still building networks of communication that don't rely on WhatsApp. Thank you. I'm done. Thank you, Joey. Thank you, everybody.
You really did a mic drop situation. Thank you so much, Masana. There's a lot to reflect on and think about at a personal, professional, and collective level. But I want to also respect other speakers' time. We're going to have a session where we can share our thoughts and reflection on what everyone has shared. So please make sure that you're writing. I have my notes here and what a dystopian future we may be having. But I can now switch to Abigail where we'll be exploring decent work in the platform economy. Is this something that we should even be talking about? Is this something that's realistic, given everything that we have had so far? Over to you, Abby.
Thank you, Joey. Hi, everyone. I hope we're good. I'd just like to start by thanking Joey and the Nawi Collective for initiating and maintaining this conversation, to my knowledge, for some years now. Because in many one of the things that you find in doing research is that in more ways than none, the voice of Africa is not really heard in a lot of these conversations. And it's so important that we as Africans, we as feminists, that we take hold of our own destiny, if I may use that word. So thank you for the work you guys are doing, and thank you for inviting me. I am currently teaching in in a university in New Zealand, so it's midnight here. And I am also a research associate in Central at the University of the Western Cape, which is actually the research unit that is housing We Care that Leah had mentioned in our presentation. And what we're doing here is very important. And thinking about what Leah and Masana, what they've laid out, the question then is, what then is decent work? There's no one single definition of decent work. Just like many things, like people have different ideas of what decent work should be. But then the ILO has kind of provided like an overarching definition of what decent work should be. And the ILO says that decent work is productive work for men and for women in conditions of freedom, equity, security, and human dignity. And we can spend so long unpacking that sentence, but I'm just going to say that from that sentence, the ILO then developed 4 strategies, which the ILO calls the 4 pillars of decent work. And we have the employment rights, we have employment rights, we have full and productive employment, we have social protection, and we have social dialogue. And then if we're to distill each of those things, they have like different meanings. So right at work, for example, would address things like labor protection, fair terms in contracts, protection against exploitative labor, protection against discrimination. Social protection would cover things like social assistance, social security, access to maternal benefits, leave, would ideally address work-life balance, occupational health and safety. We have collective rights. And then we have productive employment, which more or less considers the environment, the social legal environment in which work is done, ensuring that the work that is produced in that environment is not just quantity, is actually quality work. And then if we're to look at this in simple terms, we'll think about things like the terms in your contract, we'll think about pay, we'll think about benefits, we'll think about the design of a job, the nature of the work. We'll think about social support and cohesion, because employment is not just something we do to earn money, to make a living. Employment is also a way through which we integrate in the society. And then we also have safety at work, we have work-life balance, we have representation. But then one would then look at platform work. The question is platform work decent? Is it decent work, given this background that I have laid? Now, one thing we need to think about as Africans is that the majority of the work that is done in Africa is known as informal work. What this means in essence is work that is performed outside of the scope of any regulatory framework. Either there is no law or there is a law and the law is not enforced. And because of that, you see that in a lot of African countries, we have like a lot of street vendors, we have domestic workers. Not that this economic activities are not jobs, but they are not protected. And because of that, they are classified as being in the informal economy, which means that most of these workers, actually majority of these workers are working, but at the same time, they are poor. So when we make a comparison between informal work and platform work, it appears that in a sense, for many workers, for example, if we're to look at Uber drivers and you compare them to traditional taxi drivers, it appears in some sense that they seem to be earning better. That's actually what research has shown, because platform work is seen as a way to formalize lots of traditional activities or economic activities. Platform work is seen as a way to earn better wages. But then what then happens in platform work is platform work actually is aggravating pre-existing work deficits. So even though on the face of it, an Uber driver is earning more than a taxi driver, but an Uber driver has to do more hours to earn money. An Uber driver has to take into consideration the cost of fuel, the cost of data, and Uber driver is subject to the whims of the platforms. It's the platform that determines whether or not you get rides. The same for domestic workers. It's domestic workers on Sweep South, there's a lot of precarity in their work as against having just one employer or multiple known employers. Now you walk into the house of a stranger, you don't know what kind of person that is. Those women are exposed to violence in the workplace. Many of those women live outside the suburbs where their services are required. So they're spending money on taxi. And if you live in South Africa, which is where I lived until recently, things are becoming increasingly expensive. So you then ask yourself how a domestic worker on Sweep South is actually living, because if Sweep South, for example, charges you 300 or 400 rand, their deductions and all of that, before you know it, it appears that the person that is working for one employer is earning more money. And then Sweep South comes up with this research to show that their workers are earning more than the national minimum wage. But for a worker, it's actually beyond that. It's about security. It's about unemployment benefit. It's about having someone that is contributing to pension, because whether we like it or not, all of us are going to get old. So then the question then is platform work decent? I will say no. That's my answer. The answer is, have I spoken for 10 minutes, Joey? Okay.
Not yet.
So the answer is no, because apart from the things I've mentioned, what we still see, particularly for women, is that platform work reinforces gender stereotypes. You find that just like in the traditional sectors, there are more men that are Uber drivers for many reasons. In online crowd work, we also find that there's gender segregation. So we know that growing up, most of the secretaries were women. So you find that even in the same space, most of the secretaries are women. And then even when women have the same skills as men and bid for the same jobs, by virtue of the fact that the algorithm management has been programmed to know when it's a woman, even though they would say that it's neutral, but as long as it's being fed, as long as data is being fed into the machine, the person that is programming the machine, the person's bias is being fed into the data. And then you find that women, for the same job, women are earning less than men. For the same job, even in many instances, a lot of women are more skilled. And in a country like Nigeria, for example, research has shown that more women actually go to school, have formal education than men. But then when we look at what labor statistics are saying, labor statistics shows that women still earn way, way lower than men. And this is replicated in the platform economy. So the question that we need to think about is whether platform work, whether it can be empowering for African women. and support the realization of our rights to decent and dignified work? The answer is yes. And at the same time, the answer is no. Honestly, I don't want to sound pessimistic, but after a while, you're just wondering what's going on. I don't know. But anyways, if the answer were to be yes, it is subject to us having what we would call hard and soft laws. And if you look at the context of the platform economy, one of the things we find out is that a lot of platforms, they prefer the soft laws. Soft laws are just things that platforms will voluntarily subscribe to. So they call it self-regulation as a way to facilitate decent work. But we all know that ultimately for capitalist platform, at the end of the day, it's about profits. It might not necessarily be the money that they are making from the Uber trips. It's actually about the data that they are mining, which is so much money. If we were to follow the stories and the fines that a company like Meta has been having in different parts of the world, will understand the importance of data mining, which is the biggest thing platforms are getting from their participation in the platform economy. Because then you look at them, they say, oh, they're not making profits, but they are making so much money. Because what does data do? Data gives a way for people to be able to actually build build a way for people to actually build a profile of who a person is. And in many instances, it also includes your biometrics. So it means they can target product at you. It means they can surveil you. All of this has an impact. So platforms would generally prefer the soft laws, but then we need hard regulation. And honestly, African leaders, I say this with every sense of responsibility, African leaders in many instances are just focused on the employment contribution or the employment creation that platforms create. But really, in the grand scheme of things, the employment contribution of the platform economy in relation to the exploitative conditions of workers find themselves, they're not at par. So it means that there's also the need for African leaders to come up with regulations that provide just the basic standards for workers, and then we can then move on to other things. But if we were to look at the labor laws of many African countries, we find that many of the labor laws are rooted in our colonial history. So while the British, for example, might have developed other regulations to address particular kind of workers, what we'll find is that a lot of African countries are still in the 1960s. Their labor laws are still in the 1960s and are not reflecting the current conditions of work. So let's give an example of a country like Kenya, where Kenya is supposed to be the what's this thing in California? The tech thing in California.
Silicon Valley.
Yes, Silicon Valley. Kenya is supposed to be the Silicon Valley of Africa, and a lot of tech companies have found that, unlike a country like South Africa, for example, the labor laws in Kenya are not as strong. The labor law in Kenya, for example, does not provide for what is known as temporary employment service. Temporary employment service is a triangular relationship that provides a leeway for tech companies to distance themselves from workers. So they are getting workers through subcontractors, and they can easily say, no, we're not the employers of this workers, avoiding their obligations. But because in a country like Kenya, there is no provision for that, it makes it easy for them to thrive. But thank God that the courts in Kenya appear to know what they are doing. We're still waiting for the outcome of that case. But that's just an example of how the labor laws in African countries make it easy for platform companies or capital platforms to exploit labor. So we need hard laws that provide minimum conditions such as minimum wage, collective rights, enforcement rules that also shape soft policies. We need rules on work-life balance, particularly for women. We need rules on financial inclusion, mental health, violence in the workplace. Now, having said that, as many of us know that in the next few weeks, all the world leaders, all the world leaders would gather in Geneva, and the foremost thing on the agenda is developing a regulatory framework for the platform economy. And I'm just going to tell us that the platforms will be there with the best lawyers that are sharks. Because lawyers that they're actually looking at every word to see what every word means. Unfortunately, these guys have the capital to have these lawyers, which we as which workers do not necessarily have, and which we Africans, particularly because of our context, might not necessarily have. But nonetheless, we can be optimistic. So then, as we prepare for ILC, what should be the consideration? I think one of the first things that needs to really be considered is actually what the definition of platform work is. Platform work is very heterogeneous. There are different kinds of platform workers. So it means that if we're developing a framework for platform work, it needs to be wide enough to take into consideration the different categories of workers. And at the same time, it needs to be focused enough such that it doesn't become ambiguous. So that's one of the things that needs to be considered. And my suggestion would be, for example, for ILO's recommendation 198, which is the recommendation that looks at different forms of employment, for it to be recalled, because one of the things recommendation 198 has done is it has kind of developed parameters around the different disguises that employment comes, subcontracting, independent contractors, disguised self-employed workers, which is what is prevalent in the platform economy, temporary employment services, and then focusing it on the feminist agenda, particularly as women. One of the things that we see every time is that platform work has reinforced gender stereotypes. So what it means is that if we're going to have an international framework, we need an international framework that starts by identifying institutions, rules, and legal practices that create and legitimize and perpetuate discrimination against women and violence at work against women. And we see an example of this, for example, in South Africa, in the Machilango case, where the constitutional courts had used intersectionality lens to analyze the discrimination that domestic workers in South Africa have historically faced and continue to face, even though South Africa has been independent since 1991, 94, and their constitution is said to be one of the most transformative in the world. But still, domestic workers continued to work in exploitative conditions and were excluded from a very important labor legislation. So that for me is one of the most important things if we're looking at a platform, a framework for the platform economy that is inclusive and that is gender sensitive. Another thing that we also need to consider is data processing. One of the things with data is data perpetuates existing bias, leading to production of discriminatory outcomes for platform workers, particularly women. So we need to consider this. It's important to consider provisions that prohibit discrimination in data processing, in data mining, in data collection. And even more than that is also workers having rights to their data portability, because the socioeconomic value of data it's so immense. We are actually still establishing the socioeconomic value of data. So it is very important that workers have the right to data portability, because unlike what we typically known as work, where you can be in the same place for the next 10 years, platform work is fragmented, it's piecemeal. But at the same time, despite it being this way, workers need to be able to carry on their data across platforms, even when they want to even establish platform cooperatives. So that's one of the things that makes data portability important. And then there's the pay. Platforms popularly will scream and say, oh, we are paying more than the minimum wage. But then when we look at all of the deductions, the cost of petrol, the cost of data, the cost of working hours to make a particular money, we'll know that actually not necessarily. And then when we look at the rising cost of living in many African countries, for example, in Nigeria, where a liter of petrol is almost 1,000 naira, which is a lot of money, and we'll look at it against the realities in our specific context, we'll know that platform workers truly actually do not earn a lot of money. And another thing we really need to think about for platform workers is mental health. Increasingly, what we find is that a lot of platform workers work in very exploitative conditions. We see examples of content moderators who are exposed to graphic, traumatic content without having the right psychosocial support. And at the same time, big tech companies are deliberately making efforts to ensure that these workers don't have a voice. And apart from content moderators, is also platform workers working long hours to be able to just have basic living. All of this have an impact on mental health. Mental health in many African countries is a taboo. When you start talking about your mental health, it's like, oh my God, this person is mad. But the world we are in, mental health is so important. So one of the biggest considerations in developing a framework is inclusion of mental health in occupational health and safety provisions. And then, apart from that, we also need to think about collective rights. Collective rights are so important because it is through collective rights workers can have a voice to voice their concerns about their work, and to also, I'm almost done, sorry, and to also negotiate for their rights. Collective rights, it's actually, in my own opinion, is a foundation for whatever protection or whatever regulation we want to develop in the platform economy. But because of the classification of many platform workers, one of the things we find out is that having collective right for platform workers tend to breach current labor rules or labor laws. So, but then collective rights are very important. Now, just to end, I'm just going to say that it's very important what the ILO is doing, us going to the ILC, having the discussion at the global level. But much more than that, I think the best way, honestly, within our context is a bottom-up approach where we as Africans hold our leaders accountable. Because if we look at the disruptions in the global system, we know that really we can depend on non-Africans to have like a decent standard of living. It is left to us to hold ourselves accountable. Thank you, guys. I'm sorry if I spoke for more than 10 minutes.
Thank you, Abby. Thank you for showing us how what's happening offline is really being replicated online as well, and for really, bring out the gender dynamics and the legal dynamics around that. So again, I will let the last speaker have some time, and then we'll come back to the plenary to unpack some of the things that you have shared. So our last speaker is Sunshine, who will be bringing it home. What do all these things mean in terms of feminism as a personal project? What does that mean in our everyday lives? What can we do as consumers of all this information? So over to you, Kumsana.
Thank you, Joey. Thank you, Abigail and Leah and Masana. The privilege of speaking last is also that I don't have to say many things, which is a lie because I talk a lot, but it's always nice to say. I want to start by saying that I prepared so much for this conversation, and now I'm sitting here and looking at all my little, post-its, and I'm thinking, I just maybe need to be more present and kind of try to tie everything together because so many important things have been raised already. So I'm going to start by saying that, other people introduce themselves. Oh, hi, everybody. My name is Sunshine. I am a feminist. I'm a lawyer, and I work at the intersection of knowledge and tech justice, but really I'm just a girl. So I am from Uganda, but right now I'm in Dakar, and I wanted to talk about tech as empire. And then I realized Leah did already a good job of that. So I'm going to just say that tech is empire, but also we have to know as feminists that by design, empire cannot be feminist. And so one of the narratives that is very dominant in our work has been, we need to be able to embrace technology for feminist work. We need to embrace technology for this and that. And as Masana rightfully said, tech is definitely not neutral. And instead of thinking about tech as this, or digital capitalism as this tool that we need to infuse with feminist language, that we need to ensure is working for feminist work. I think the things we need to be asking ourselves, or maybe some of the questions we need to be asking of ourselves, are in what ways are we complicit, and also in what ways. And that is not a question that is supposed to bring shame or guilt, because shame and guilt are not useful emotions for the revolution. But we also need to ask ourselves, what can we do while we remain within these systems? What kind of organizing can we do that changes our material conditions, the material conditions of those of us who are on the margins of this superstructure that is digital capitalism? What can we do that chips away at it while we also, participate? So essentially, I'm asking us to be comfortable with our contradictions and our paradoxes. And so the other thing I wanted to talk about is connecting our work. So we are fragmented, right? So I want to read some of the things that I wrote in preparation, but I also want to kind of go by what conversations have been happening. And I want to talk about just really my experience in March when I went to CSW. It was the first time I was going to CSW. I don't know how many years CSW has been happening. I danced for the US visa, I think for about 18 months. To be able to even get an interview, I did the things. I had I prepared for this trip. I forgot my warm clothes in Kampala. It was a whole thing. And then I arrived in New York, and I just, there was just a certain and obviously I am conscious of like the context in which we are organizing right now. There's a lot of panic, there's fascism, there is US madness, there's all of these things. But I remember watching feminists run, or women's rights people run across Manhattan trying to get in 150 meetings. Most of those meetings, we don't even really have influence or access. And thinking, what am I doing here? I'm cold, the food is bad, I miss my friends. I had some friends in New York, but I missed the friends back home. I don't feel like in any ways I am contributing to this process. And yet I have spent so many resources to be able to be here. So have the people who are here. And I'm not saying that these spaces haven't or have not created change for us, but I'm saying that there's almost a certain feeling of we must be here because this is where the change in itself lies. And I think that we are missing an opportunity to kind of check if this is the most useful use of our time and resources. And yeah, so when I think about space and conversations these days, because I'm required to prepare, I'm required to have nuggets of wisdom that are likable and tweetable and Instagrammable, I am overwhelmed almost because technology and global capitalism has robbed us of many things, but conversations just for the sake of talking, for the sake of gist, for the sake of gossip, which I love, and sharing in our own human experiences of being has been taken away, right? So the goal has been, I think, from the invention of technology and all of these digital platforms to have a lifelong subscription from us of our attention, of our resources, and now we see of our rights. So, but you can't blame us, right? Technology is nice, it's shiny. I mean, I love a meme or 6, and we also we've also been robbed of this ability to dream of alternatives that are not looking like the thing that we are trying to run away from. So when Silicon Valley or Silicon Savannah or China is inventing the shiniest new thing, as feminists we are running towards, can we have a solution? Can we have a strategy? Can we have an advocacy plan immediately to counter this thing? And the truth is, we neither have the deep pockets nor the spirit of extractivism to be able to create inventions and strategies at the speed of an Apple whatever upgrade, right? We don't have we don't have the tools in terms of resources, but also that's not who we want to become. And so the question is, so what do we do, Sunshine? We just chill and just ignore what's happening? And that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that while I don't want to put us in a position where we feel like we can't work within the systems, we also have to look outside of them. We have to pay attention to ourselves. Community above everything else, right? First, one of the things that Masana also mentioned that I wanted to talk about was like class solidarity. When we talk about platform workers, for example, there is a story that IT for Change has done an interview around people who have been slaves to this content moderation work. And one of the people said that the minute that story was aired more publicly, I think CBS covered it under that program called 60 Minutes. People were reaching out to him, he's Ethiopian, and saying, how can I get this work, right? How can I be able to earn $2 an hour to do this work? And the truth is, when the unemployment problem in our parts of the world is at 40%, people are not hearing all these warning signs. People are hearing salaries in US dollars. And also governments have essentially battered our labor rights in exchange for in exchange for jobs that they cannot provide in the face of mass unemployment. And we've also kind of coiled into our individual things. Okay, does that mean I shouldn't use Uber now? Does that mean I shouldn't use this platform now? But the truth is, our solutions and our work has never come from individual actions. That's capitalism. So we have to to work towards collective action, we have to first name and sit with our contradictions. I've said that, but we also have to move away from thinking that challenging technology is through individual actions. So first of all, anything that centers the power of the individual above the collective is capitalism and neoliberalism persevering. But because this is how we've ended up here, but we also have to invest consistently in building alternative, I don't want to say technologies, but alternative ways of working that don't just alienate platform workers, but support them, right? So I think labor movements, obviously our greatest teacher in this moment. I was in a conversation recently and someone mused about the idea of a global tech strike, even if it's just for a day. And I thought that those are like just great examples. But the point is, we have to create the spaces to ideate, to dream, and not to have these fears around the next new thing is missing some feminist theory, and we need to find the theory and the language to infuse and work towards it. Because also right now, I am really not as optimistic as I usually am, because we are missing the moment where we have a fear of losing resources when you think about the funding ecosystem and what's happening. And so we can't rely on governments that have continuously sold us out. We can't rely on institutions, neoliberal institutions, American institutions, institutions in the global north, including the process for which we are having these processes. They can move the needle for us, but we can't, as feminists, imagine that that's where our collective liberation lies. I want to conclude by saying that, what is my concluding remark? It has to be something really clever. And I have so many things that I want to say in conclusion, but okay, let me do this. So I'm part of this fellowship right now that is really about critical consciousness and trying to think about the work that we are doing or not doing around just consciousness rising. And I want to just challenge us to think about how we can learn about innovation, how we can learn about tech, how we can learn about all these processes that are happening, but without letting that be the primary way in which we exist. Find your friends, contribute to a mutual aid. Find for people who work within homophobic context, like the majority of us, contribute to queer folks, food banks, and just the idea is to be able to decenter technology, but also recognize that we work and exist within technology. So just finding ways in which we chip away, but also continuously to build our own communities that sustain us. Well, that's how I live. And I know that many of us feminists on this call are how we aspire, or the world that we imagine to exist in is a world where we don't have to constantly be fighting for our survival. And truly building a sustaining community is how we survive. And when I think about community, I'm a little more optimistic than when I think about tech for development or tech for change. So yeah, thank you. And really, I hope you have no hard questions for me, because I have no answers, like I said. So thank you again, everyone. I've learned so much from this conversation. Yeah.
Wow. Thank you so much, Sunshine, and all the speakers. I know that our time is really fast spent and the interpreters have other sessions to be part of. But I'll just open it up to the floor for 3 minutes. 3 minutes. Please forgive me if I am not able to take all the questions and comments. But this is, like I mentioned at the start, this is a series of webinars that are happening throughout this month. And so we'll have one next week on Wednesday as well, where we'll hear from workers and their experiences. And then we'll have the last one the other week. So just opening it up, if you have any questions, comments, you can put your hand up. Make sure that I can see. Morozi, please let me know if there's any hand that I am not seeing. Okay, please unmute.
Hi, my name is Milania from Kenya. I'm sharing my device with Lucy. It's interesting to hear how we are actually redefining the work that we do at different levels, and as feminists on calling out different institutions and also calling out government, and also looking at where did we go wrong and how do we make it right at different levels. My question would be maybe from the first speaker who was talking about femi economics. For a long period of time, we have tried to define the feminine economics in a different way. And as a feminist organizations, I don't know if it is only me or others, we never want to be accountable for the, I'll call it the bad behaviors or bad characters that we have. When it comes to maybe resources on how we treat even fellow women at workplace. When we talk about unpaid care work, how do we make sure that if I am talking about it, I'm able to also practice it at workplace and also at my own personal level? Because most of us might be having house technicians, but at open level in spaces like this, I'll be the first one to call out a certain person on not being able to pay someone properly or do the work properly. But at my own personal space, in my own private space, I'm the same oppressor that is busy talking about unpaid care work. If I'm talking about SRHR, if we are talking about ILO 190, I'm the same person who is also oppressing other people in spaces. How do we call in and call out our fellow feminists in different spaces? If we are talking about government on labor laws, on labor rights, how do we also come together as feminists and say it is a collective responsibility? The same way we talk about SRHR, it is not something that we say in Kenya, SRHR is this way, in Uganda, SRHR, it's a collective responsibility for women in their own category, be it that I am a woman with disability, I am a woman without disability. But when it comes to SRHR, it's a component that comes out for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you for that intervention. And unfortunately, that's the only intervention I'll be able to take today. The speaker whose question, who you asked, has had to go off. I don't know, Sunshine or Abby, if any of you would like to take that question. Hello?
Sure, I can try. I know I said I don't want to answer any hard questions. It's a hard question. The question of calling out, calling in, the question of, I think all of our feminist praxis has to come from humility, knowing that we are not also infallible, that we are also that in the ways in which we are also capable of harm. And so I also want to tie this to something about surveillance. So because of technology and surveillance, we have become a movement or people who surveil each other because we seem to know so much about each other because we subscribe to the attention economy. And so because of, there's like a certain rage and baiting of rage that the cult of the algorithms creates for us, and it seems fashionable to be able to constantly call each other out mostly, and so I do think that we have to cultivate new cultures of having conversations about things we don't agree on. I think we also need to take a lot of our conflict and conflict resolutions out of the offline or off stage. And we also have to know that we being constantly like picking on each other is by design, and so yeah, it's honestly like an antithesis to building community. So yeah, we just need to start talking to each other without wanting to provide the word salad provided by algorithms and TikTok therapists. I'm such a hater, clearly, but what I'm saying is we do need to reframe also our cultures around conflict and how we talk to each other when we don't agree. So yeah.
Thank you so much, Sunshine. I am going to have to put a stop to our conversation today, acknowledging that Zoom burnout and everything that's happening everywhere. But thank you so much for being part of the first session, and a reminder that this is a series of webinars, and so if you registered for the first one, you'll be able to have the same link for the rest of the sessions. Thank you to the speakers. And I hope that these are conversations that you have found relevant, and that even in your work, these are things that you can start teasing out depending on the work that you do. Yeah. The Nawi Collective and all the people that we are collaborating with are always open to working together and connecting with feminists. So please feel free to reach out to us, and I hope to see you in the subsequent conversations. Thank you to the interpreters as well. I'm so sorry if there were any glitches and issues. Hope to clear those out in the next sessions. And have yourselves a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe.